Hello everyone, welcome back to Foot Forecast. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing if Eddie Howe should be sacked at Newcastle. And it's been a tough season for Howe, but I think this is a really interesting conversation to have. At the end of the video, I'm going to discuss some potential replacements for Eddie Howe, and I'll do this even if I say I think he should stay as the manager. So I'm going to start with the reasons why I would sack Howe. And my first reason is that there's a clear drop-off from last season. Newcastle are out of all of the cups and they're currently 12th place in the league. This is very disappointing for a side like Newcastle who are wanting to progress forward every season. And European football looks very unlikely, as well as Champions League football. And this is because they're unable to handle multiple games a week, Newcastle. And look, this may not be a problem next season, but this is definitely a potential problem going forward for Eddie Howe and Newcastle. And what's concerning about this isn't the first time that multiple games a week have been a problem for Newcastle United under Eddie Howe. There's 2 seasons ago when Newcastle won the Champions League, they really struggled and they had similar issues. And this season, it's arguably been a bigger problem. And defensively, they're just not as good this season compared to previous seasons. Newcastle. And they've struggled against the weaker sides this season, unable to get up for the game, which is a real problem and something that Eddie Howe has actually criticised this season. And it's also because they struggle when teams play deeper in low blocks, and they've just become a very predictable side, and there's just not enough attacking creativity from Newcastle. And on top of this, they just concede too many late goals. This is a real problem for Newcastle United this season. They just conceded that really late goal to Sunderland, but it's also happened in other games where Newcastle look like they should get 3 points, but they just can't get over the line. And this is something that Eddie Howe really needs to improve, the in-game management side of how do you manage those last 10 minutes of games, because they've been unable to do this, and players just aren't improving under Eddie Howe anymore like they once did. I think that's a notable drop-off. I don't think many players this season for Newcastle have looked better than they did last season. And this is something you expect from a manager like Howe, who's been very good at developing players in the past. On top of this, Newcastle spent a lot this summer and they just haven't been rewarded for the spending. Is there reasons why this has existed? Obviously, with the Isak situation, Newcastle not getting the targets that they want, but it's still a lot of money to spend. And at the end of the day, I just don't think Howe is the manager that's going to win Newcastle a Champions League or a Premier League. But that doesn't mean I don't think he's a good manager. I just don't think he's an elite manager. But despite me saying this, I think there are reasons why you would keep Eddie Howe as manager of Newcastle United. He took Newcastle from a relegation battling side to a side in Champions League football, and he won a trophy last season. That was so impressive, and he overachieved in the first, second and fourth season at Newcastle. So he's definitely been a successful manager for them. He's proven he's a good enough manager in the past to get Newcastle into top 4 or top 5. So there's definitely reasons to stick by Howe. As well as this, there's definitely some mitigating factors for why they've struggled this season. Injuries has been a real problem for Newcastle. How much do I think this is a problem to really talk about? Not too much, because a lot of sides have had injury problems this season and they perform better than Newcastle. The other point is that they are competing in multiple competitions, but as I've already said in this video, this is something that Howe needs to learn to adapt and understand how you deal with these multiple competitions, which he hasn't been able to do so far. The other mitigating factor is the disaster of a summer that Newcastle had. They obviously had the Alexander Isak drama, but then they were just unable to replace him / bring in the players that Eddie Howe wanted. And on top of this, they didn't have a sporting director, and Howe was basically in charge of signings, which is too much responsibility for a manager. Howe needed someone up above them that's sort of directing the transfers and what sort of business they're looking to do. And because of this, I don't think Newcastle's a complete squad, and I think there are some weaknesses in that side. As we've been seeing, the attack doesn't seem to really work, and that's the reason why Newcastle have struggled this season. And overall, I don't think all the players have turned on Eddie Howe as a manager. And sacking Howe at the end of the day could make Newcastle worse next season. So I'm now giving you reasons why I would sack Howe and why I wouldn't, and I'm going to give you the final verdict. I think there are better managers out there than Eddie Howe that could take Newcastle forward, maybe closer to sort of title challenges like the goal is. But in saying this, I would only make the change if there's a clear better option than Howe, as I think Howe can get Newcastle into Champions League next season and he could potentially win them a cup. So what I'm going to do now is go through and rank all the potential Eddie Howe replacements. But I'm going to start by actually ranking Howe so then I can compare them to some other options. And where I'm going to rank Eddie Howe is a C-level manager for Newcastle. I think he's a decent manager, but I don't think he's the manager that's going to take them forward in terms of putting themselves into title races. But I think he's a manager that can get Newcastle into Champions League football next year. So then we're on to the potential replacements, and we're starting off with Areola. He's obviously done a very good job with Bournemouth and previously did a good job with Rayo Vallecano, and I can see him as a manager that could maybe take Newcastle forward to that next level. But at the same time, how much upside does it have compared to a manager like Eddie Howe? I don't think a whole lot. I think it's more risky. I think there's a chance that Areola doesn't get Newcastle into Europe next season or Champions League football, which I think Howe will. But at the same time, I think Areola is more of a manager that could take Newcastle closer to winning a title or at least challenging for a title. So for that reason, I'm going to put Andoni Areola in C, the same tier as Howe, but I don't think I would make that replacement. Then we're on to the next option. I think this one's maybe a bit more unrealistic, and that is Julian Nagelsmann. I don't see him going to Newcastle, but if there's a chance, I think they should definitely consider a manager like this. This is a manager that could take Newcastle to that next level, potentially a title challenging side. So for that reason, I'm putting Nagelsmann straight in there. He did a good job at Bayern Munich despite being sacked, and he plays very good sort of high pressing, sort of attacking football. And in terms of that sort of lack of creativity, I think he would solve that. Then we're on to the next option, which is Oliver Glasner. Now, I'm not convinced this would be a good appointment for Newcastle. I think in some ways it would be a backward appointment. I think he's probably a lower level than Eddie Howe, or maybe just at the same level, but he's not a more progressive manager than Eddie Howe. He's more a counter-attacking manager, and I don't think that's what Newcastle needs. So I'm putting Glasner in E. I see no improvement on Eddie Howe, and I don't think this is a good appointment for them at all. Despite this, I actually think Glasner's quite a good manager, but I just don't think he suits a side like Newcastle. I think he suits a side more in Serie A with sort of his style of football. So then we're on to the next manager, which is Pochettino. I like the idea of Poch. I think he's a good manager, and he's a manager that could take them forward into maybe a title challenging side like he did with Spurs. That's sort of how I look at this appointment as a potential appointment for Newcastle. Quite similar situations. In fact, I'd actually say that Spurs side that he took over was worse, and he made it into a very good side. Obviously, having Harry Kane did help, but I really like Pochettino's football. It's attacking football, it's pressing football. It's something that Newcastle can get behind, and I think he is a better manager that's more attractive as well for players to maybe sign for than an Eddie Howe, and I think he gets them closer to where they want to be. So for that reason, I'm going to put Poch in B. Why is he not an A? Well, I don't think he's a title-winning manager like Nagelsmann would be. So then we're on to the next manager, which is Fabregas. He's done a very good job with Como, a very attacking manager. Looks to be one of the better managers that we may see in the future, and I think this would be a decent replacement for Eddie Howe if they did decide to sack him, but I'm going to put him in the same tier as Eddie Howe. I think it's similar to a Andoni Areola appointment where it could go wrong, but I think there's probably more upside in terms of, I think a Fabregas side's more likely to challenge for a title and take you to that next sort of step. So then we're on to Enzo Maresca. I think Maresca did a good job with Chelsea, despite maybe not always getting the results that you expect from a Chelsea manager. But I think that's more due to how incompetent the Chelsea owners are. And I think this would be a very good option for Newcastle United. I think you would get them playing some good football. And I think he's at quite a similar level to Eddie Howe as a manager. But I think he's a manager that's more likely to take Newcastle to that next step. So for that reason, I'm going to put Enzo Maresca in B. I think this would be a good appointment for Newcastle to make. and I think it would arguably be a manager that you'd take the risk on, and maybe you would potentially sack Howe before. So then we're on to Thomas Tuchel. I think this one is pretty unrealistic. I don't see Tuchel going to Newcastle. I think he would prefer to go to another side that's a bit more established. But if you can get Thomas Tuchel, then he's straight away going in A. He's proven himself in some top clubs. He did an excellent job with Chelsea, winning the Champions League, coming in mid-season. I also think he's quite an adaptable manager, and he can sort of change his tactics when needed, which I think is something that Newcastle could use, because I think at times Howe can get tactically outclassed by other managers. Let me know your thoughts on this video. Where do you disagree? Where do you agree? Would you sack Eddie Howe? And do you agree with my sort of view on this? Would you be willing to sack Eddie Howe if a better manager did appear, or a manager that's more likely to take Newcastle forward? And if you enjoyed this video, it'd be great if you subscribe to the channel as well as liking the video.